The egg had rested in the deepest room of the nursery for 10 years, wrapped in a soft nest of blue moss, and nobody had dared to move it. The Drackery called it the quiet egg because, unlike every other egg in the nursery, it made no sound at all. No heartbeat, no shifting, no warmth that grew with the seasons. It was simply there, a smooth silver shell kept apart from the newer clutches, like a grave that had never been properly closed. Dr. Elise Carter had heard the story many times since she came to live on Ostron. She knew about the storm that struck the coast 10 years ago, the crash of a small human ship, and the sacrifice made by its captain to save one last egg from the flood. She knew the egg had never hatched. She had always assumed it never would. That was why, when Elder Illith called her to the nursery in the middle of the day, urgent and out of breath, Elise nearly refused to believe the words. "The quiet egg is moving," Illith said. "Come now." Elise ran through the tunnels of the nursery, past rows of warm eggs glowing faint gold under their caretaker's watch, until she reached the sealed chamber at the back. The other keepers stood at a careful distance, unwilling to get close. In the center of the room, the silver egg trembled. Thin cracks spread across its shell like frost on glass. Then it split open. What came out was small, wet, and strange, a hatchling no bigger than a house cat, with scales the color of moonlight and wings folded tight against its narrow body. It blinked twice, shook itself, and let out a soft, uncertain cry. For a moment, everyone in the room relaxed. It looked like any other hatchling. Fragile, harmless, new. Then the alarms began. Every monitor in the chamber lit up red at once. The nursery's life sign systems, built over centuries to track the heartbeat of every Drackery hatchling from the moment of birth, could not make sense of what they were reading. The rhythm coming from the tiny silver dragon did not match anything in the Drackery registry. It was too fast in some places, too steady in others, built on a pattern that belonged to a completely different kind of creature. Elise recognized it immediately. She had heard that exact rhythm during her medical training, years before she ever left Earth. It was a human heartbeat. Not similar to one, not close to one, exactly one, beating steady and strong inside a dragon's chest. "That is not possible," one of the keepers whispered. Illith did not answer. Her eyes were fixed on the hatchling, and on something happening around it that nobody in the room could stop. The hatchling's tiny heartbeat was not staying inside its own body. Every Drackery hatchling is born linked to its brothers and sisters through something the Drackery call the heart link, a bond that lets an entire clutch feel each other's pulse, breath, and fear from the moment they hatch. It is how they learn to move as one, protect each other, and grow into a family that will never truly be alone. Through that same link, the silver hatchling's strange new heartbeat began to spread. One by one, in nesting shelves throughout the chamber, the other hatchlings went still. Not asleep, not resting. Still, in a way that made the keeper's skin crawl, eyes open, chests barely moving. Every one of them locked onto the same unfamiliar rhythm, now beating through the link like a drum none of them had ever heard before. The whole nursery went silent. No cries, no shuffling claws, no soft growls of hunger or comfort. Dozens of hatchlings, some only hours old, sat completely frozen, their small bodies pulsing in time with a heartbeat that had no business existing inside a dragon's chest. Marshal Drake arrived within minutes, alerted by the emergency signal that had gone out across the settlement. He pushed past the keepers without a word and stopped at the edge of the chamber, staring first at the silver hatchling, then at the rows of unmoving hatchlings around it. "What did you bring into this place?" he asked, though he was not looking at Elise when he said it. He was looking at Illith, as if the old elder had personally invited disaster into the nursery. "I brought nothing," Illith said quietly. "This egg was already here. It has been here longer than most of your soldiers have been alive." Drake's hand moved toward the weapon at his side, more out of habit than intention. "Then explain why every hatchling in this nursery has stopped breathing normally at the exact same moment a human heartbeat started inside that thing." Nobody could explain it. Not yet. Elise knelt slowly beside the small silver dragon, careful not to make any sudden movement. Up close, she could see its chest rising and falling in perfect rhythm with a species it had never met, on a planet it had only just been born onto. It did not look dangerous. It looked lost. She placed 2 fingers gently against its side and felt the pulse beneath her hand, warm and fast, and painfully familiar. "I don't think this is an attack," she said, more to herself than to anyone else in the room. "I think this is a memory." Nobody answered her. Around them, the nursery remained frozen in its strange, borrowed silence, waiting to see what would happen next. The record vault beneath the human embassy on Ostrin had not been opened in years. Dust covered the shelves, and the air smelled of old metal and sealed plastic. Dr. Elise Carter stood in the doorway with a request slip in her hand, a request that had taken 3 separate approvals and 1 long argument with the embassy's senior administrator to secure. She was looking for anything connected to a ship called the Wanderer's Hope, and its captain, a man named Daniel Reyes. Most people on Ostrin did not know his name anymore. 10 years is a long time, and the humans who had lived through the crash either transferred back to Earth or grew quiet about what happened. But Elise had read enough fragments in old embassy files to know that whatever happened during the long storm was not a simple accident, and that it was somehow connected to the silver hatchling now lying frozen in the nursery with a human heartbeat in its chest. She found the file in the 3rd row, a data drive marked only with a date and a case number. When she loaded it onto her console, the first thing that appeared was a photograph of a man in a worn flight uniform, smiling at the camera the way people do when they do not know a photograph will end up being one of the last things anyone remembers about them. Captain Daniel Reyes, age 34, commander of a 4-person survey ship sent to study early signs of Dracari civilization from a respectful distance, long before any formal alliance existed between the 2 species. According to the file, Reyes and his crew had picked up a distress call during what the embassy records called the Long Storm, a violent weather event that struck the coastal nursery grounds without warning. The storm was strong enough to flood entire tunnels and threaten the outer shell of the nursery's containment structure. An entire generation of Dracari eggs, kept in that structure for safety, was at risk of being destroyed within hours. Reyes had no reason to help. His mission was to observe, not interfere. First contact protocols at the time strictly forbade any direct involvement in Dracari affairs. But the records showed that he broke that protocol without hesitation, landing his ship as close to the nursery as he could and leading his small crew through rising floodwater to reach the eggs before the storm surge hit. Elise scrolled further and found something she had not expected, a personal log, recorded by Reyes himself in the final hour before the storm reached its peak. She played it. His voice was rough, tired, and strangely calm. He explained that most of the eggs had already been moved to higher ground by the time his crew arrived, but 1 egg remained trapped beneath a collapsed support beam, cracked along one side and losing warmth fast. There was no way to move it safely, and no way to repair the beam in time. His crew wanted to leave. He told them to go. Then he explained, in a voice with almost no fear in it at all, that he was going to try something his science officer had been developing for over a year, an experimental device meant to create an empathic link between 2 different species, so that humans and unfamiliar creatures could someday understand each other's feelings well enough to build real trust. It had never been tested outside of a lab. It was not designed for this. He used it anyway. The recording ended there, cut off by static and the sound of the storm outside. Elise sat in the quiet of the vault for a long moment before continuing the file. The rest of it was simple and cold, written in official embassy language. Captain Daniel Reyes did not survive the long storm. His body was never recovered. The 1 egg he stayed behind to protect was later found intact, still warm, buried under collapsed stone that should have crushed it completely. That egg was the quiet egg. It had taken 10 years to hatch, silent and still the entire time, as if it had been waiting for something. Now Elise understood at least part of what that something might have been. The device Reyes used had never been meant to save a life by force. It was built to share feeling, will, and instinct between 2 very different minds. In the final seconds of his life, with no time left and nothing else to give, Reyes had poured everything he had, his heartbeat, his courage, his refusal to let the egg die, directly into the 1 living thing he could still protect. It had worked in a way nobody had planned for. Instead of simply keeping the egg alive, it had planted something inside it. A piece of the man himself, carried quietly inside a dragon's growing heart for 10 silent years, until the moment it finally hatched, and the beat that had once belonged to Daniel Reyes started again in a small silver body under Austrian sky. Elise closed the file and sat back, letting the truth settle over her. The hatchling was not a weapon. It was not an accident, or an invasion, or a trick played by humanity on an unsuspecting species. It was the last living piece of a man who chose, in the worst moment of his life, to save something that was not his to save. She thought about Marshall Drake's cold question in the nursery. What did you bring into this place? She finally had an answer. She only hoped it would be enough to save the hatchling's life. By the third day, the keepers had stopped calling it strange behavior and started calling it something else, change. At first, only the hatchlings closest to the silver newborn showed any difference. A pair of siblings who had always slept curled together suddenly separated, each one standing guard at opposite ends of their nesting shelf, eyes open, watching the tunnel entrance as if they expected something to come through it. Another hatchling, barely 5 days old, refused to back down when a much larger juvenile Dracary wandered too close to its nest, hissing and snapping instead of retreating the way every hatchling before it always had. By the third day, it was not just a few hatchlings. It was most of the nursery. Elise Carter watched it happen from behind the observation glass, taking notes she was not sure anyone would believe. Hatchlings that should have been too young to understand danger were suddenly acting like they had something worth protecting. Hatchlings that should have simply obeyed the older Dracary on instinct were, for the first time in the nursery's long history, questioning why. Elder Illith found her there on the third evening, watching two hatchlings work together to drag a loose piece of bedding over a crack in the wall, sealing it without being told to. You wanted to know why the whole nursery went silent, Illith said, settling beside her. I think I finally understand it well enough to explain. Elise turned to listen. Illith explained that most outsiders misunderstood the heart link. They assumed it only connected heartbeats, a simple biological signal passed from one hatchling to another. In truth, the heart link carried far more than that. It carried will. It carried the deepest instinct of whoever's heartbeat entered it first, spreading outward through every connected mind like ripples across still water. Every generation of hatchlings before this one had entered the world already linked to each other, so their instincts had blended evenly, with no single voice louder than the rest. But this clutch was different. This clutch had one heartbeat enter the link late, after the others had already begun to settle into their bond, carrying an instinct completely unlike anything Dracary biology had ever produced. When the human heartbeat entered the link, Illith said, it did not simply join the others. For one moment, it overwhelmed them. That was why the nursery had gone silent that first day. Every hatchling in the room had, for a brief and terrifying instant, felt someone else's will pressed directly against their own, a will built entirely around refusing to let the ones it loved be destroyed, no matter the cost. It was not malice. It was not an attack. It was simply the last, desperate resolve of a dying man, echoing through minds too young to understand what they were feeling. They had not stayed silent because they were afraid of the hatchling. They had stayed silent because, for the first time in Dracary history, an entire clutch had felt something that refused to give up. Elise absorbed this slowly. So the changes we're seeing now, she said. The protectiveness. The refusal to just obey. That's not damage. That's them keeping a piece of it. Illith nodded. A very small piece. But yes. It was, in its own way, beautiful. It was also, to certain members of the Dracary Council, an emergency that could not be allowed to continue. Marshal Drake requested an emergency session that same night, and Elise was summoned along with Illith to answer for what the reports were now calling a full disruption of nursery behavior across an entire generation. Drake did not waste time on formalities. An entire clutch of Dracary younglings, he said, addressing the small council directly, is now displaying instincts that do not belong to our species. Instincts introduced by a human artifact planted inside one of our own eggs. I do not know what this will grow into if left unchecked, and I am not willing to find out. They are not sick, Elise said. They are not dangerous. They are protecting each other. Today, Drake said, what happens when that protection decides we are the threat? Nobody in the room had an answer strong enough to satisfy him, and Elise could see, watching the faces around the table, that fear was winning the argument more easily than truth ever could. Drake proposed what he called a necessary correction. The silver hatchling, along with every other hatchling still carrying signs of the disruption, would be removed from the nursery and destroyed before the influence could spread beyond this single generation. The council did not vote that night, but Elise understood, walking out into the cold air afterward with Illith silent beside her, that the vote was coming, and coming soon. Somewhere behind them, in a nursery still recovering from its first silence, a small silver dragon slept with the heartbeat of a man who once refused to let anything he loved be destroyed. Now something else he loved needed protecting, and it could not protect itself. Elise had never had to defend anyone's right to exist before, and she found, standing outside the council chamber with a small recording device in her hand, that she did not know how to make her hand stop shaking. Inside, 9 Drakery council members waited in a wide circle of stone seats, with Marshal Drake standing near the center, already speaking before Elise had even entered. Elder Illith sat quietly near the back, her presence more a formality than any real influence, since elders were permitted to advise the council but not to vote. Drake's argument had not changed since the emergency session 3 nights earlier, but he had refined it. He described the disruption spreading through the nursery in careful, measured language, avoiding words like fear and choosing words like risk instead. He explained that no matter how harmless the hatchlings appeared now, an entire generation carrying instincts foreign to Drakery nature was, by definition, a threat to what it meant to be Drakery at all. "We did not survive this long," he said, by allowing convenient exceptions to sacred bonds. When it was Elise's turn to speak, she did not try to match his tone. She simply placed the recording device on the stone floor at the center of the circle and played the final log of Captain Daniel Reyes. The chamber went quiet as his voice filled the room, rough and steady, explaining in plain words that he had chosen to stay behind for one egg that was not his to save, using a device that was never meant to work the way it ended up working. There was no dramatic speech in the recording, no grand declaration of sacrifice, just a tired, frightened man choosing, in the last minutes of his life, to protect something small and helpless because it was the right thing to do. When it ended, nobody spoke for a long moment. "That is a human's choice," Drake finally said. "Not proof that his choice belongs inside one of our own." "No," Elise agreed. "But it's proof of what kind of instinct got passed into that egg. Not violence. Not conquest. Protection. The same thing every one of your own hatchlings has been showing since the moment it woke up." Drake's jaw tightened, but he did not answer immediately, and Elise understood that for the first time since this began, she had made him hesitate rather than dismiss her outright. It was Illith who finally spoke, rising slowly from her seat near the back of the chamber. "There is an old way to settle disputes like this one," she said. "Older than Marshal Drake's doctrine of purging any bond considered impure. It has not been used in generations, because it has rarely been needed. It is called the trial of bonding." She explained that, in the earliest days of Drakery civilization, when clutches were sometimes born with unusual traits that frightened the elders of that time, disputes over whether a hatchling belonged within the community were settled not through argument, but through action. The hatchling in question, along with its bonded clutch, would be placed in a situation of real danger. If their instincts protected the clutch and helped it survive, the hatchling would be accepted fully, without further question. If their instincts endangered the clutch instead, the matter would be considered settled, and no one would be permitted to argue against the outcome. "You are proposing we risk an entire clutch of hatchlings," Drake said, "to prove a point." "I am proposing we let the truth prove itself," Illith answered, instead of deciding it in a room with words alone. The council debated for the better part of an hour, but in the end, even Drake could not argue against a method built into Drakery tradition long before he was born. The trial of bonding was approved, to take place within the week, timed to coincide with the arrival of the seasonal storm season already building along the coast. Elise did not like the timing. Storm season on Ostrin could be unpredictable, sometimes gentle, sometimes violent enough to threaten entire settlements the way it once had 10 years earlier. But she understood, watching Drake's expression as the council announced its decision, that he had chosen the timing deliberately. If the storm turned dangerous, the trial would not be a symbolic test. It would be real. Real enough that a group of hatchlings only days old might not survive it. Walking out of the chamber afterward, Elise found Illith waiting for her in the corridor, calm in a way that Elise could not understand. "You don't seem worried," Elise said. "I am terrified," Illith admitted quietly. "But I have watched that little one and its siblings for days now. I have seen what instinct moves through them when they believe someone they love is in danger." She looked back toward the nursery, where a small silver hatchling slept curled among its brothers and sisters, unaware of the trial that would soon decide whether it was allowed to keep living among them at all. "I believe," Illith said, "that this storm will show them exactly what that man already showed us once." The storm did not knock politely. It arrived 3 hours early, tearing across the coastline while half the settlement was still moving emergency supplies into position for the trial. Wind tore through the nursery's outer courtyard hard enough to bend support poles that had stood firm for decades, and within minutes, the sky over Ostrin turned the color of old bruises. Elise had been standing near the observation deck with Illith when the first alarm sounded, and she felt her stomach drop the moment she understood what was happening. This was not the gentle test the council had expected to observe from a safe distance. This was the same kind of storm that had killed Captain Daniel Reyes 10 years earlier, arriving early and angry, exactly when a chamber full of hatchlings only days old happened to be inside the nursery's outer testing chamber for the trial. Marshal Drake reached the observation deck moments later, his expression unreadable as emergency lights washed red across the glass. Below them, in the reinforced chamber built specifically for the trial, the silver hatchling and 11 of its clutch siblings were gathered on a raised platform, surrounded by monitoring equipment and thick containment walls that were, at that exact moment, being tested far harder than anyone had planned. The first support strut gave way less than 2 minutes into the storm. It cracked along an old stress line near the ceiling, sending a shower of debris down toward the platform below. The hatchlings scattered instantly, panicked, scrambling in every direction with the same helpless confusion any frightened young creature would show. 2 of them froze near the edge of the platform, directly beneath a second strut that was already beginning to bend under the pressure of the wind screaming through a crack in the outer wall. "Get them out," Elise said, already moving toward the access door. "There isn't time," Drake said, and for the first time since Elise had met him, his voice did not sound certain of anything. He was right. The access corridor leading down to the chamber was already flooding with water forced in through a secondary breach, and the emergency systems needed at least 90 seconds to reroute power before anyone could safely open the reinforced door. 90 seconds was far longer than the bending strut above the frozen hatchlings had left to give. Inside the chamber, something changed. The silver hatchling, smaller than nearly every other creature in the room, stopped scrambling. It planted its feet against the shaking platform and let out a sound none of the observers had heard from it before, low and steady, nothing like the panicked cries filling the chamber around it. Through the heart link, that steadiness spread. One by one, the scattered hatchlings slowed. Not stopped, not calm exactly, but no longer blind with panic either. Elise watched through the observation glass as 2 of the older hatchlings turned back toward their frozen siblings instead of continuing toward the far exit, moving with a purpose that looked less like instinct and more like decision. Together, 3 hatchlings threw their weight against a section of loose flooring beneath the bending strut, wedging it upward at an angle just steep enough to redirect the falling debris away from where their siblings stood frozen. It was clumsy. It was desperate. It should not have worked, not with creatures this young, this small, working against a structure far heavier than any of them. It worked anyway. The strut came down at an angle, sliding harmlessly off the wedged flooring instead of crushing the platform beneath it, and the 2 frozen hatchlings finally broke free of their panic and scrambled clear just as the emergency systems below finally rerouted power, sealing the breach and stabilizing the chamber's outer wall in one shuddering burst of light. The storm did not end there. It raged on for another 20 minutes before finally weakening enough for the settlement's systems to fully stabilize. But inside the trial chamber, the danger had already passed, and when the access door finally opened, Elise found 12 exhausted, trembling hatchlings gathered close together in the center of the platform, alive, unharmed, and utterly unwilling to separate from one another. At the center of the huddle, the silver hatchling lifted its head as Elise approached, its small chest still rising and falling with that same impossible human rhythm, now steadier than it had been since the moment it first hatched. Marshal Drake arrived a few minutes later, moving slower than usual, his eyes fixed on the same scene Elise was still trying to process. He said nothing for a long time, watching the hatchlings curl protectively around each other, still shaken but whole. I expected them to scatter, he finally admitted, quiet enough that only Elise heard it. I expected fear to win. It didn't, Elise said. Drake did not answer right away. He crouched slightly, studying the silver hatchling with an expression Elise had never seen on him before, something closer to uncertainty than judgment. No, he finally said. It didn't. Behind them, the storm continued to weaken, and inside the chamber, a nursery that had once gone completely silent now filled, slowly, with the small, steady sounds of hatchlings breathing easy again. 3 weeks after the storm, the council chamber was fuller than Elise had ever seen it, and for the first time since she arrived on Ostrin, nobody in the room looked like they were bracing for an argument. The formal vote took less time than the debate that led to it. After the events of the trial, after 12 hatchlings had proven with their own small, desperate actions exactly what kind of instinct had entered their clutch, there was little left to argue about. The council voted unanimously to accept the silver hatchling as fully Dracary, bonded and belonging, with no further restrictions placed on its life within the nursery. Marshal Drake cast his vote along with the rest, and though he did not speak during the session, Elise noticed he did not avoid looking at the hatchling either, the way he had during every previous meeting. Something in his posture had shifted since the storm, quiet but real, like a man who had built an entire argument around a fear that had simply failed to come true in front of him. After the vote, Elder Illith approached Elise with a request that surprised her. Every hatchling accepted into this community is given a name chosen by someone who cared for it during its first difficult days, Illith explained. Usually that honor falls to a keeper or an elder. In this case, I believe it should fall to you. Elise had not expected the responsibility, and for a moment she felt the same uncertainty she had carried since the first day the silver hatchling cracked its shell open. She thought about the recording of Daniel Reyes, about the calm certainty in his voice even as the storm closed in around him, about a man who chose, without hesitation, to protect something small and defenseless simply because it needed protecting. She thought about a bird she remembered from home, small and unassuming next to larger predators, but fierce enough to defend a nest many times its own size without ever backing down. Kestrel, she said. Her name is Kestrel. Illith repeated the name slowly, testing its shape, and nodded with quiet approval. Within the nursery's old traditions, a name given with intention was considered a kind of promise, and Elise found herself hoping it was a promise the little dragon would grow into rather than struggle against. In the weeks that followed, Kestrel grew quickly, the way most Dracary hatchlings did, her silver scales darkening slightly with age, her wings finally strong enough to carry her short distances across the nursery floor. She remained close to her clutched siblings, the same small group of hatchlings who had worked together to survive the storm, and something in their bond seemed different from other clutches Elise had observed, steadier somehow, less easily shaken by fear. Her heartbeat never changed. It still carried that same unmistakable human rhythm, strong and steady, a permanent part of who she was rather than something that might one day fade. The nursery keepers stopped treating it as strange after a while, and eventually stopped mentioning it at all, the way anyone stops noticing something once it simply becomes part of daily life. Elise visited often, though her official duties as xenobiologist rarely required it anymore. She told herself it was for research, but she suspected, more honestly, that she simply wanted to see how the story continued. One evening, she found Marshal Drake standing near Kestrel's nesting area, watching the young dragon curl up between two of her siblings for the night. He did not seem to notice Elise approaching until she was nearly beside him. I was wrong about her, he said, without any of the sharpness that usually colored his voice. Not about the danger. The danger was real. I was wrong about what would win, given the chance. Elise did not answer immediately, giving him space to finish the thought on his own. I have spent my whole life believing that strength alone keeps a nest safe, Drake continued. I did not expect to learn otherwise from something this small. He left without waiting for a response, and Elise watched him go, thinking that whatever had shifted in him that night in the trial chamber had clearly stayed shifted. Later, sitting alone in her small office at the embassy, Elise finished writing her final report on the case of the silver hatchling, now formally recorded in Dracarys records as Kestrel, first of her kind, accepted fully into the nursery she was born into. She reviewed the report twice, correcting small details, before adding one final line at the bottom, something not required by any embassy format, something she added simply because she believed it belonged there. Captain Daniel Reyes did not die on Ostrin, she wrote. He just started beating in a new chest. She saved the file and looked out toward the nursery in the distance, where a small silver dragon slept peacefully among her siblings under a sky that had once tried to take everything from both their species and failed. The alliance between humanity and the Dracarys had been built, until that point, on treaties, careful language, and years of cautious diplomacy. Now, for the first time, it had something else. A living symbol neither species had planned for, small and steady, carrying 2 hearts' worth of courage in one growing body. Nobody could silence her again.